Welcome to Liberty Legion, where sensibility rises above radicalism and liberty stands above all. Join us as we bring common sense back into the conversation for freedom and for the future. Now here's your host, Aaron.
Welcome back to Liberty Legion. I am your host, Aaron Brantley. If you could, please subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to, leave a rating, and even shoot me a message or a comment as to what you think about this week's episode. Now, the government shutdown is nearing an end, the longest one we've ever had, and I think Americans overall are frustrated, again, that it just feels like Congress has failed us. Whether you're on team left, team right, don't care, you were just frustrated by the shutdown, whatever it is. It feels like, once again, the Americans came last. And what I find interesting is overall satisfaction or approval of Congress. It's consistently low, although we don't have a very high turnover of these members of Congress. And one issue that 86% of Americans would support, bipartisan Democrats and Republicans, independents alike, is to ban stock trading within Congress. Now, while millions of Americans lost jobs, lost savings, it was chaos and a massive struggle for so many Americans during the COVID era, some Congress members saw double-digit returns on stock trades they made. And guess what? Nothing came of it. So the question is, if insider trading is illegal for the rest of us Americans, and we know we would likely see charges or face consequences, why don't the members of Congress? In fact, even when it looks fairly obvious, they don't even lose their jobs. They typically could possibly be reelected. Now, today we're going to get into COVID. There were, a few members of Congress in the Senate, particularly, who participated in stock trades that raised an eyebrow because it really, really felt like they were making trades based on insider information they had before news about the pandemic broke to the public. And then we'll talk about Nancy Pelosi, who has the most epic reputation of just defying the market alongside her husband, doing even better than some of the top experts on Wall Street. And we'll talk about the Stock Act and how the intentions may have been pure, but it has failed overall as far as ceasing the insider trading activity within Congress. So let's dive into it. So members of Congress and their families regularly trade millions of stocks annually, okay? We know that, it's allowed, that's what they're doing. And like I said, 86% of America obviously sees an issue with this because they would like to ban stock trading within Congress. And then there were COVID briefing trades. This was one of the most recent scandals and probably the most recognized scandals, okay? And it exposed what a lot of people saw as insider access. And these were well-timed trades before major legislation, all right? And again, both sides agree. I'm sure if you talk to the typical Democrat voter and the typical Republican voter, they would agree that this is a problem that should be addressed and this shouldn't be happening. In 2020, the Department of Justice probed into several senators and it ended with 0 charges. Even with what looked like very obvious timing of these trades, the very difficult thing about insider trading is proving intent. And that's where the waters get very murky. And then there are some protections within Congress, all right? The speech and debate clause, which gives them a layer of protection around their activities while they are serving in Congress. So several members of the Senate sold some stock just before the stock market crash on February 20th of 2020. And we know that was from them coming out with a news briefing and the pandemic was announced. And the argument is that they likely used knowledge given during a Senate meeting that was held on January 24th, 2020. So before the public knew about the extent of the pandemic and what we might be seeing ahead, some stock trades were made by these senators after this meeting. The Department of Justice initiated an investigation on March 30th, 2020. No charges were ever brought, and the investigation was ultimately closed. One of these individuals was Kelly Loeffler and her husband, who was also the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange. They made 27 transactions, which totaled between $1.275 million and $3.15 million, and 2 transactions to purchase Citrix Systems, which saw an increase following the correction. David Perdue made a series of 112 transactions, with stock sold for around $825,000 and bought $1.8 million worth of other stocks. He also started buying around $185,000 in DuPont, which is a company that makes personal protective equipment. John Hoven of North Dakota bought $250,000 in health science companies 5 days after the briefing. So again, before the public, briefing was given or before the public were aware. Senator Burr, which was probably the most prominent one, he was the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He ultimately ended up stepping down. But on February 7th, he said the U.S. was positioned better than any other country to handle the pandemic, a very hopeful messaging. But then on February 13th, he sold an estimated of $1 million in funds. Now, the reason given for closing these investigations and no charges being brought was insufficient evidence of using non-public information. Now, the ultimate perception that came out of this is rules for thee, not for me. I understand that intent is difficult to prove, but it just grinds my gears, and I know many other Americans' gears, that these Congress members are able to profit off of inside information they're getting through their service as a public servant. They're there to serve their constituents, and they're all profiting off of it. Okay, maybe not all, but I will say majority. And nothing has been done to really put a stop to this, despite majority of Americans wanting it to stop. So let's talk about Nancy Pelosi, probably one of the most common names to come up when we discuss insider trading, because she famously just outperforms the market. Her and her husband just do so well, it just happened to. What a coincidence. There's even the Pelosi tracker, which tracks her trades. So you can try to also profit as much as she's profiting. One common case is NVIDIA and how much she has made off of NVIDIA. Even if these things are legal, which I have my own suspicions, I don't believe that they are, obviously, it erodes public trust. And this is on both sides. Okay, the Democrats are not immune. The Republicans are not immune. We talked about that 2020 incident, which was primarily Republicans. And we talked about Nancy Pelosi, who had a extraordinarily long career in Congress, profited an insane amount of money, never saw any type of consequence. Just claimed, she's always denied that any information that she received from her time in Congress was not used to profit for her own interests. Again, I have my own suspicions, but that's just my opinion. She has not been charged with any insider trading. All right, let's talk about the law that failed. This is the Stock Act. It was passed in 2012. With the intention to reaffirm that Congress cannot participate in insider trading, right? They're not exempt from insider trading laws. There's never been any criminal charges filed from this act. Not a one. And we're 13 years in. And most violations end with a whole $200 fine. There's weak penalties. The penalties are not consistently enforced, and violations aren't made public. So we have no transparency as to it looks like my representative violates this quite a bit. Maybe that's something I want to consider for the next time I vote for them, because this seems like maybe an integrity issue. Nope, you don't get any of that information. It also has created very inadequate deterrence, because we continue to see this happen, right? This was implemented in 2012, signed into law by Obama. And in 2020, we had these COVID trades happening right in front of our faces. Nothing was done. And it kind of seems like it was passed mainly to just appease the public, rather than to create actual real consequences and true deterrence from insider trading. So I mentioned earlier the speech or debate clause. That paired with weak enforcement just creates kind of an immunity for Congress, okay? SCOTUS has ruled that prosecutors cannot use a member's legislative acts or the motives behind them as evidence, which really, really handcuffs prosecution when we're talking about insider trading, because again, you have to also be able to prove intent. And if you're very limited into what you can bring into a court of law as evidence, that makes the case almost impossible to charge. This protection extends to activities that are an integral part of the deliberative and communicative processes of legislative work, such as staff assistance and fact funding. And they can just say nope, my husband just made this trade, just, on a whim. How are you going to truly prove? I doubt these people are going to be writing in text messages or emails. They could easily have a conversation with their spouse. Hey, we got this briefing about COVID getting really, really bad. I think we should dump some stocks. Or we should go purchase some self-protection stocks, right? Or stocks in companies that provide self-protection equipment or certain medical equipment. So again, I think it was kind of a, hey, look, we did this. And there's really no teeth to it whatsoever. It hasn't changed anything realistically in regards to the activities within Congress and insider trading. So if it feels like we can't effectively charge insider trading, then we've got to figure out something else to create a deterrence for insider trading, or at least help the public feel more assured that they're not, immune from the rules that we as American citizens have to abide by outside of Congress. One idea that has come up and been floated around, I believe it was Josh Hawley maybe who introduced this or brought up introducing it, which was banning individual stock trading by members and family. That could face some legal challenges, and we'll kind of talk about that later on. Another one is to require blind trusts for all holdings. This is personally my favorite option. So their investments would be managed without their knowledge or participation. So they don't have to completely divest, because that could create a deterrent for really qualified or really fantastic individuals who we want to serve or who their constituents want to represent them from running for office. If they feel like they have to just sell off their whole stock portfolio and not, just put it on hold for either 6 years or 2 years, depending on how long they're in Congress. Or they'll maybe only want to serve 2 years, even if they do a great job, because they're like, well, look, I'm missing out. I think a blind trust is great. They can't make trades. There's no participation allowed. They can't see what's going on. It's just managed outside of their control. So they don't have to divest. They can still benefit from the market and their investments, but they also can't benefit from insider knowledge coming from their activities within Congress. You could also mandate 48-hour, so real-time disclosures versus this 45 days is the window in the current Stock Act, and then publish that automatically. So ensure that the public has immediate access to what their representative or senator is doing within the market. Transparency can always be a deterrent when it comes to these individuals wanting to run for re-election, right? They all want to stay there forever, it seems. And so the more knowledge we have about our candidates and our representatives and our senators, the more we're able to make an informed decision. You could increase penalties and empower independent oversight. Now, the penalty, the $200 is kind of just a joke, but I think if you mandated the real-time disclosure and published it, I think that I wouldn't be necessarily as concerned about the violations. Maybe you could increase them. And then you could also require recusals from votes tied to personal investments. Now, if they have a blind trust, I'm not as concerned about that. They wouldn't even have to do that because they can't participate in the investment activity. Some of these could face constitutional challenges. So we talked about the speech or debate clause, and a member may argue that managing one's personal finances is a right of all citizens and that Congress cannot pass a law that unduly restricts their private, non-legislative knowledge and motives. Now, the counter argument to that would be that such restrictions are necessary and reasonable as far as a condition for holding public office designed to ensure public trust and prevent corruption, which are compelling government interests. I do think a blind trust could likely withhold constitutional scrutiny because they are still able to invest. We're just ensuring that there's a buffer there where they're not profiting off of their investments. Because to me, that's such a corrupt motivation for some of these individuals to get into office and stay there for decades. It's like, look, I'm able to quadruple my net worth in a short amount of time because I'm able to make all these trades, information on contracts that might be coming out or being awarded to certain companies, a whole pandemic, and making strategic trades based on that and profiting. So, and again, they're not facing consequences for this. So it's kind of, they're going to do it. It's going to be a motivation for some. And we can stop that in its tracks by implementing blind trusts. So now I always like to include in my episodes because I don't want to just, there's a lot of brilliant political commentators out there. And I always want to bring you guys some information about what you can do as citizens, okay? And how you can step up and get involved. And one thing you can do is contact your representatives and support bipartisan trading bans. There's already some bills that are floating around out there. There's the Restore Trust in Congress Act, which was introduced in the House by Chip Roy, and it proposes a ban on individual stock trading by members of Congress and their families, with exemptions for diversified funds or mutual funds. As of September 2025, it's newly introduced and seeking traction. So this would be the time to call your representative and senator or email them and say you support this and ask what they're going to do to push this along or ask their stance on it, because next year is election season for some of these senators and for representatives. There's the Ban Congressional Stock Trading Act. This is the Senate version. This was introduced by Mark Kelly and John Ossoff. It would require members of Congress, their spouses, and dependent children to put their stock portfolios into a qualified blind trust or divest them altogether. That is one that I would support more. I think you're going to have a harder time constitutionally with the Restore Trust in Congress Act. So depending on which option you prefer or lean towards, call and try to get these pushed forward. This one was introduced in May, okay? So it's not dead. There's older bills that are still pending. But again, those two are active in the Senate and the House. And so that would be the way to capitalize on that. Also, it might be worth in the same call talking to your representatives and senators about some transparency tools. Like, if we're not going to pass these, can we introduce a bill that's more likely to pass that would just increase transparency and increase the fines in the meantime under the Stock Act? Just amend the Stock Act to include increased fines, maybe hit them with $10,000. They wouldn't like that. It might go too high, but whatever they're willing to do above 200 is a joke, right? And then make sure that they shouldn't have 45 days to report these. It should be 48 hours and make them public for us all to see. Share watchdog reports. So some tools are Campaign Legal Center, Open Secrets. You can kind of see what might be available on there, and vote for a candidate who supports either of these bills. And I genuinely hope the GOP takes this chance to get these passed, because I think it's such an easy win bipartisan wise. 86% of Americans are hungry for this type of legislation. And if the GOP could pass that, it could show, look, we actually do want to represent the people. To me, transparency without enforcement is all theater. I think it is helpful for you as a voter to have that information, yes, but there's no real consequence. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people just don't pay enough attention as far as what their candidates are doing. Corruption always thrives on apathy. That's why we are where we are. That's why we have such a low congressional approval rating amongst Americans. we're checked out. We're focusing on some other issues. We focus primarily on the presidential office and not as much on our representatives and senators and what's going on there. And so we need to start expose that. Social media is fantastic for exposing corruption. If this is a topic you're passionate about, get those bills passed, put people on blast who are not supporting them, and we'll see what impact we can maybe make with that and use as leverage for next year's elections in 2026. And I believe that freedom is trust in government. And when they profit from crises like the pandemic, they're breaking that trust. And we know that the trust, I feel like, amongst the American people has been broken for so long with our representatives in government. And maybe it's time we take a step towards restoring that. So I hope you learned a little bit more about insider trading within Congress, and also more importantly, learned some things that we could do to improve this very bipartisan issue with some common sense legislation that doesn't even have to be that complicated. So thank you for tuning in again this week. I will be back next week with another episode. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. And I'm truly, truly grateful that you are a part of the Liberty Legion community.